How does the Mass start? Does what happens at that moment pull us away from the mundane and the secular, or not? Here we are with our fellow Catholics, where we certainly wish to look beyond this immediate world, which is so distracting, testing, sometimes indifferent to us, sometimes hostile. Thus we may imagine the Christians of Rome in the early centuries escaping from their pagan world and their most definitely hostile surroundings and huddling into the hardly lit darkness of the catacombs, warm, closely pressed in with each other, indeed smelling, to modify a phrase of Pope Francis, of each other. So we, having come off the street and into the church, instead of being surrounded by the strangers in that street, find ourselves in the midst of our Catholic community, elevated in spirit by the beauty of our surroundings and of the sacred music we hear, so that we become, as it were, transported into another sphere, that of the divine. This, of course, is the theory. In practice, we don't usually feel like that at all, unless we're lucky enough to be, perhaps, in the oratory. Instead, we may feel that quite a lot of the world has come in through the church doors with us. If you're used to going to Mass at a major London church or a monastery, this may not be your experience. But out in the provinces, things are different and can indeed be quite difficult liturgically, even desperate at times. If we're at an old rite Mass, we can perhaps feel a little more confident about certain things. But in either ordinary or extraordinary form, we're greatly helped if there's something more to aid our human frailty and lift our minds and hearts away from the banal and secular and up to God. And in John Dryden's translation of the Veni Creator, we find this: "Plenteous of grace, descend from high, rich in thy sevenfold energy. Make us eternal truths receive, and practice all that we believe." That phrase, "practice all that we believe," does not just refer to our daily lives, but to the liturgy too. The liturgy must be the practical expression and demonstration of what we believe. And lex orandi, lex credendi, has never been a more important maxim than it is now in this faithless age. So let's think about that phrase, as Dryden puts it so perfectly: "Make us eternal truths receive." One thing which can do that for us most powerfully is music, though whether or not that's the primary purpose of music at Mass is something we'll return to later. R.H. Richards, the founder of the Association for Latin Liturgy, wrote that intensification of religious experience is far from being a luxury, it is a necessity. The pressures against belief, intellectual certainly, but principally psychological, are very severe, and every device that counters these needs to be brought into play. Many of the pressures come from our secular environment, but there are also internal pressures, such as that exercised by the desacralized liturgy that has become our most frequent fare. It is difficult to feel that there is anything behind it. It does little to support belief or to suspend disbelief at the unconscious level that determines so much of our behaviour. That's the end of the quotation, and that was written in 1978. I wonder how much we think things have changed since then. So the way a sung Mass starts is of great importance, and it's not really thought about enough by clergy or by laity. The people who really should think about it, of course, are organists and choirmasters, though whether or not they do so is sometimes doubtful. Let's think about how they should do it, and we'll leave the question of hymns to a bit later on. Before the introit, in the extraordinary form, and at the penitential rite in the ordinary, sung Mass has something additional, the asperges, or in Paschal time, the vidi aquam. Here's something else that could give us an entry into the theological as well as the musical order of things. Vidi aquam, egredientem de templo, a latere dextro. I saw water flowing out of the temple from the right side. As we listen to this now, let's imagine how those theological sentiments and and the music itself focus our minds as the Mass begins. So that's done the trick, hasn't it? It's done many things. It's slowed our heartbeat down. It's brought us into a different frame of mind from the one in which we came in. And this is the sort of thing that we need. Unfortunately, in many places, even in some cathedrals, the introit itself is often replaced by the choir director with some alternative piece of music with a text chosen at random, often inappropriate. Indeed, they often choose music without looking at the words at all. We need to be clear about what's acceptable here, what is desirable, and what is neither desirable nor acceptable. Hymns are commonly substituted for the introit, and that is not always a good thing, even though it does produce active congregation involvement. If there is a choir whose singing is so good that it uplifts all who hear it, then it should sing the introit, either in chant or polyphony, during the entrance procession. And the minds of the congregation will be moved into the right state of mind for the Mass that is beginning. But if the choir singing is in itself not terribly helpful to listen to, it's better if it leads the congregation in a simple introit chant, preferably of a Gregorian kind, accompanied by the organ to give it some foundation warmth, as that was there. So much for the beginning of Mass. Now, how should it end? In the extraordinary form, when the priest or the deacon sings, "Ite missa est," he doesn't mean it. You shouldn't go. You should stay where you are, because there are still things to come. There's the blessing to come, the last gospel, and perhaps the Domine Salvum Flac as well. The reason for this is of some historical interest, and its effect is that the ite in the older rites has become like a landmark, which used to be on the last point of land before you reach the sea. But because of the movement of sand and soil, has over time worked its way inland. So it's not the end. But in a Novus Ordo sung Mass, when you sing Ite missa est, you could go. But in practice you don't, because musically something will probably happen here. What? Well, one of the nicest and most Catholic things that can happen is for the sanctuary party to process to the statue or altar of Our Lady and sing Salve Regina. But you may not be so lucky. You may find yourself singing "Praise my soul, the King of Heaven," or some other well-worn Anglican hymn. I have nothing against Anglican hymns, as long as they stay where they belong. I spent some years singing them there, actually, in the choir at Chichester Cathedral, where I was a lay vicar, and in that setting they were fine. I was actually the first Catholic to sing in that choir since the Reformation, and when I took the oath before the Dean and Chapter, I had to promise not to subvert the faith of the established church, but they were very tolerant of a mere Catholic. So let's think about these hymns. The practice of singing vernacular hymns at Mass began in Germany. After the Council of Trent, it enabled a non-Latinate congregation to participate vocally in the action of the Mass. And I'm sure, indeed, there must have been a stimulus from the Protestant Reformation and the very popular singing in the Lutheran Church, which people could take part in. I'm sure that must have given a spur to the Catholic Church to do something similar. But in England, it didn't become anything very much until well after the Emancipation. The very nature of requisite liturgy was hardly conducive to something as noisy as hymn singing. So, where might hymns play a useful role? In one church I know, not very far from here, the sung Mass on Sunday always ends with a hymn to Our Lady. Whereas at other churches I frequented, including the cathedral in the provinces where I go regularly, I have never, ever heard a hymn to Our Lady. Let me try you with a few titles. O Mother Blessed, whom God bestows, Mary Immaculate, Star of the Morning, Hail Queen of Heaven, the Ocean Star. They may be familiar to you. You may or you may not think that they still have a place at Mass. You may find their archaic 19th century pious English presents difficulties. Personally, I don't, but there are people who do. And in addition, there's a whole category of hymns centred on devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Now, these really belong to benediction, once regularly celebrated in most parishes, but now, alas, rarely so. Some of these hymns are famous. Sweet Sacrament Divine, O Food of Travellers, Angels' Bread, O Jesus Christ, remember when thou shalt come again, Soul of my Saviour. There can be a place for these actually at Mass, and that's during the distribution of Holy Communion. Sung quietly, unhurriedly, meditatively, and sensitively accompanied by the organ, these hymns can do much to restore the sense of devotion and prayerfulness, which has been lost from this part of the Mass, especially now that it's preceded by the handshake of peace, and that the regrettable practice of receiving communion without kneeling is almost universal. The other thing that often happens at the end of Mass is that we may be treated to a display of the organist's skill, if we're in luck, and if he or she is a proficient player. Does this organ music have anything to do with the Mass itself? Well, the answer depends really on where we are in time and place. If we're in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in 1635, hearing Frescobaldi's Fiori Musicali, the answer is very much yes. In his organ masses, woven around the appropriate plainsong melodies, the music forms an authentic part of the liturgical action, and so the chants being sung by the schola are heard on the organ in various different forms, and we'll hear a little bit of that in a moment. Something of the same sort occurs with 17th and 18th century French organ music, though in that case there's a rather less authentic identification with the chant. Or we might be at Mass on a section day and hear Messiaen, Prière du Christ montant vers son Père. And in Messiaen, the music is a compelling manifestation of faith. So, if there is a really good organist, and he or she plays something excellent and uplifting, as the priest leaves the sanctuary and as we prepare to go, that is much to be thankful for. If we can go out to face the world game and to glorify the Lord by our lives, then we should appreciate the organist's work. Speaking as an organist, though, what usually happens when one starts playing the outgoing voluntary is that everyone starts talking very loudly, and the organist wishes they'd go outside to do that. Anyway, here is the conclusion of the Mass of the Apostles for organ from the Fiori Musicali of 1635 by Frescobaldi, an ideal way to set the faithful on their way rejoicing. Its sectional structure provided much rhythmic liveliness, as well as melting harmonic progressions. chose that because I like playing Frescobaldi, but Bach, people do just as well. But I think he's really got something quite extraordinary. Now we approach a really important question. At a sung Mass, are we to be auditors or participants? If we're talking about the post-conciliar rite, we especially have to consider the question of participatio actuosa. Although I think it was actually Pope Pius X who first used that phrase long before, but this is where, with the new rite, this is where what was translated in English as active participation came very much to the forefront. But whether that means participation that is outwardly physical and vocal, or one that is interior and mental, or indeed whether it means both, has been debated for a long time. But there's no doubt that the English active participation does not convey the sense of actuosa in Latin. There's no doubt that Vatican II did emphasize music as a means of participation by the faithful in the communal nature of the liturgy. Pope Paul VI saw professional music as being largely out of place, saying that it was the people who should sing. So let's think about the effect that different kinds of music have on the Mass and on us. Stepping outside the Catholic tradition for a moment, in a parallel case, I'd like to mention what I heard Professor Dermot McCulloch say at a lecture in Oxford recently on the English Reformation of music. Under Edward VI, church organs were destroyed throughout the country, and polyphony was threatened, and Cranmer, in his Book of Common Prayer, codified a said vernacular liturgy. Cranmer would have hated choral evensong, McCulloch said, which I thought was quite interesting. But in terms of worship, the Anglican Church, after the reign of Elizabeth, became schizophrenic. In its cathedrals and some greater churches, such as Westminster Abbey, organs were restored and elaborate choral music flourished, despite the hostility towards it of many senior clergy. But in ordinary parish churches, a severely Calvinistic ethos and practice prevailed, with the exclusive use of metrical psalms and the general destruction of organs. In some ways, though less badly than in the 1970s, in today's Catholic Church, we are in an analogous position. We may go to the great church just there, or to Westminster Cathedral, and have an experience that is different in absolutely critical terms from that which is produced by the third-rate settings used in most churches, or by the guitars and drums, which, though the 70s are long past, still disfigure many liturgies. You could argue that this is a cultural rather than a doctrinal divide. The guitar strummer may be of the same orthodox mind, doctrinally, as the person singing Palestrina, perhaps. Very likely he is, she is. But they may also regard each other's music with horror and loathing. And they often do. So it's not like, say, Calvinists and Lutherans in the 17th century, who disagreed about everything, doctrine and music. There's another big factor here now. The Swiss historian of the Renaissance, Jakob Burckhardt, remarked that great historical transformations are always bought dearly, often after one had already thought that one had got them for a bargain price. The wholesale abandonment of Latin is a good example of this. There's no doubt that the use of Latin gave to the Roman Church a great strength past ages, and the removal of it contributed quite substantially to its subsequent weakness and disunity after the Council. It soon became obvious that Latin would never regain anything like its former ascendancy in the Church. To build up that tradition took nearly 2 millennia. To destroy it was a matter of a few short years. But it is not, as its critics and enemies thought, and indeed hoped, it would, died and disappeared completely, although in many places it has. In recent years there's been a bit of a resurgence, but for that to become more widespread and significant, we need to have more ordinary congregations singing in Latin. I'd like to say a word here about the chant in English, which has become very common indeed in the Catholic Church in England, and which features prominently in the CTS missals incorporating the new translation. And as I worked on those, and as they developed, I could see that the prominence given to the English plain chant became more and more. The question is it Catholic to sing English plain song, or is it Anglo-Catholic? I'm not being facetious. I just don't think that it's a good idea. I don't think that a Roman Catholic sung Mass should sound like a Church of England sung Eucharist, but it often does. And it just makes us sound that little bit more insular, less Catholic, less sure of ourselves. You may disagree with me, I find that many people do over this, but I think it needs to be said. There are some Catholics who might perhaps call themselves traditionalists, who adhere to what was for centuries the general practice, that of hearing Mass silently, being content with having the server make the responses and the choir sing the proper and the ordinary. I used to be like that, actually, a lover of the blessed matter of the Mass, identifying rather romantically with the English recusants, who weren't actually romantic at all. There's nothing very romantic about being fined and ostracised. But I've come to think differently. I think we should have a voice in the Mass. And it's always been the aim of the Association for Latin Liturgy, which I've worked for many years, to campaign for the active participation, both said and sung, of congregations in the Latin Mass in the ordinary form. And since we must be candid and admit that spoken Latin is never going to be comfortably within the capabilities of most Catholics, the way into that participation is mostly going to be through singing. Singing the Kyrie, Gloria, Sanctus and Sanctus Dei, and by means of antiphons and simple refrains, such as we're publishing in our Graduale Pavum, singing the whole proper of the day. Now, there's something else we have to cover here, which would be interesting to know afterwards what you think about this, the responsorial psalm. I've actually just been to Mass at the Oratory, and I noticed that in the responsorial psalm there is no response. The priest just reads it through. The responsorial psalm presents problems and opportunities. One of the problems is the extreme banality of the translations currently in use. And another is the dreary and cliched music that's been manufactured for it since 1970. I've no doubt that the Gregorian psalm tones are the best things to use here. They have a natural simplicity, grace and flow, not to mention a pedigree going back into the first Christian millennium and beyond. When we come to the gradual and alleluia or tract in chant, as they're found in the Gradula Romanum, these are a quite different matter. They are difficult, complex, professional music, and are sometimes very long. Some badly, they are excruciating and interminable. Some, well, they have a sublime character like nothing else. How can they work today? The answer is really only in monasteries and in larger churches with good choirs, and in circumstances when no one is in a hurry. Otherwise, it's best to use a simplified, but still Gregorian form of these chants. The central piece of music in a sung Mass is the credo. Central in the temporal sense, in that the ordinary is preceded by the Kyrie, Gloria, and followed by the Sanctus and Agnus Dei. And central because it is our profession of faith, even though it didn't become part of the Roman Mass until about the 11th century, having first appeared under Charlemagne, Gallican liturgy. Because the credo has more words than in the other parts of the ordinary, in nearly every musical setting it's the longest piece. You could argue that it's the one set of words that everyone present ought to sing. It's okay to have the choir singing "Glory be to God" on our behalf, and "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord" on our behalf. That's fine. But it's less appropriate for us merely to listen to choristers singing "I believe in one God" on our behalf. Ironically, with the translation we had until recently, "we believe," it would have been all right for the choir to sing it for us, including us by implication. but in practice they never did. The other thing is that unlike the Kyrie, the Gloria, and the Agnus, the Credo is not a prayer. It's a statement, an assertion, and that makes it a different sort of thing, intellectually, emotionally, and musically. It's rare in this country, although you do sometimes in Germany and Austria hear a choir singing a polyphonic or classical credo, though there are many wonderful settings. In practice, what usually happens is it is said by everyone, or sometimes sung alternately with the choir, usually credo 3, just occasionally credo 1. Though actually the best chant is credo 4, which is never sung. It's very, very good. Out of habit, it's often sung too fast and without enough thought, but it's hard to keep it fresh. I found when I rehearsed and practicing the ordinary of the Carthusian Mass with the monks, I've worked with the Carthusian Order in England for many years, they have very few optional chants. They just have one credo. They don't have any alternative versions. And they found that singing the credo with real attention, when it was repeated so frequently with identical music, was very, very difficult. Now, here's a problem which is peculiar to the Novus Ordo, which is that of keeping the celebrant waiting at the altar. Why is it a problem? Should we do it? We're going to listen to the Sanctus at part of the Benedictus from Mozart's Spatzenmesse, the Sparrow Mass. And whilst enjoying it, I hope, also imagine yourself in a congregation, standing up, looking at the priest, who is facing you, waiting for the music to stop, so that he can start the Eucharistic prayer. You might also like to imagine yourself as that priest, standing at the altar, looking at the congregation, waiting for the music to stop, so that they can kneel down. Lovely stuff, isn't it? But it's much better in a Novus Ordo Mass if it's being celebrated ad orientem, and the priest and the congregation are not looking at each other while that's going on, but they're looking at God. Much better. If you can't manage that, it's better to have a chant sanctus with the congregation singing, or if the choir is singing polyphony, to have something like the Byrd 3-part Mass or 4-part Mass. They're short, but they are intensely devotional. Okay, now we're going to think about memory. There's a marvellous book by Francis Yates called The Art of Memory. If any of you are readers at the Warburg Institute, you'll know all about her wonderful scholar. And in this book, she points out that Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas both regarded the use of a system of memory, the systematic training of memory, as a moral and religious duty. Why? Because they saw it as part of the cardinal virtue of prudence. Aquinas regarded memory as being bound up with our very identity. We are who we are because of what and whom we remember. That is us. Our memory is us. That's Aquinas saw that. The fact that we can all say the Hail Mary without hesitation makes us Catholics, and is at the same time an intrinsic part of each of us. Similarly, we manage the Lord's Prayer in Latin or English. That's just because actually it hasn't changed. Change is the enemy of memorization. That's one reason why there's often resentment at change, and why you still sometimes hear people muttering rather crossly, and also with you. Of course, we are not like Aquinas, of whom early biographers say that as a boy, he committed to memory everything that his teacher said. Later, he trained his memory under Albert the Great at Cologne, and it was said of him by a contemporary that his collection of commentaries of the Fathers on the four Gospels, prepared for Pope Urban, was composed of what he'd seen in various monasteries, but he hadn't copied any of it down, he'd just seen it. His memory was said to be of such capacity and retentive power that it retained everything he read, everything he read. One big advantage that even ordinary medieval monks and nuns had over us was that they sang so much from memory. Before the invention of printing, they all had to memorize the entire Psalter, from which the greater part of the office was drawn. Only 3 or 4 cantors had sight of the large manuscript antiphonal in the centre of the choir. We will see pictures of these colossal things. But most people didn't see those. They just had it in their heads. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but they had it. Even after the invention of printing, the night office was for a long time sung in the dark from memory. And even today there are monasteries where Compline is still sung in the dark from memory. Actually, they're mostly Benedictine monasteries, and in the Benedictine breviary it's the same psalms every night, so it doesn't make a bit of difference. We don't have any of this. We are book-bound, type-fixated. And don't flatter yourself that using a tablet or mobile phone is any different. Indeed, the life lived through digital devices only increases our dependence on having words put in front of us, so that our memory functions in less and less depth. The priest doesn't generally say or sing Mass from memory, even though he could. But there's a different reason for that. Even the words of consecration, which he surely knows by heart, he reads carefully and attentively from the book. In the first 3 centuries of the Church, before there was a fixed canon, the prayer of consecration was said extempore, though doubtless leaning heavily on the institution narrative in 1 Corinthians. But such improvisation is naturally frowned on today, although one did occasionally hear some pretty odd things of that kind in the early 1970s, I can tell you. So where, if at all, can memory have a function for today's congregation at Mass? Well, I was trained as an altar server to make the responses from memory from a very early age, and I could say, Adeo quide tificat juventute meam, in my sleep. And even though I'm no longer using this, I still can, which goes to show that if you really want to inculcate liturgy into the memory, you have to do it with children. How feasible that is these days, I'm not sure. But thinking about memory, music, and the Mass, we find there are remedies, especially to be found in the chant. An antiphon interspersing the verses of a psalm or some other chant, such as Attende Domine, is very effective in binding us into a liturgical action without our constantly having to refer to a book or leaflet. The pioneering work being done by my ALL colleague, Father Guy Nichols, on our major project, the Graduale Parvum, puts this principle successfully into action. The Graduale Parvum is essentially the Graduale Romanum in a form in which a small choir or schola of modest abilities can lead any congregation in a liturgically worthy sung mass in either Latin or English. The same chants adapted for both languages. The congregation learns its simple refrains and antiphons by repetition and can even do it without having printed copies at all. Aquinas probably would have thought it rather feeble, but for our present situation, I think it's the best thing to do in an ordinary parish. And last summer we celebrated a Missa Cantata in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at Buckfast Abbey with modest musical resources, a schola of 3, an organist discreetly accompanying some of the chant on a beautiful little chamber organ, in which with minimal preparation the whole congregation was able to participate in a Novus Ordo sung mass entirely in Latin. And it was agreed by everyone there that the celebration displayed, as one of them said, a noble simplicity and true devotion. Here's an example of a special chant with a simple refrain. It's the Salve Festa Dies, Hail, Great Feast Day, sung by the monks of Pluscadin Abbey in Scotland. They say of this, our custom at Pluscadin is to precede the conventual Mass of Easter Day with an outdoor procession, headed not by the usual processional cross, but by the Paschal candle, solemnly blessed at the vigil, and powerfully symbolizing Christ's resurrection. The hymn is by Venantius Fortunatus, who also wrote our Holy Week hymns, Pangelingua and Vexillaratus. And here it is, with its memorable repeated refrain. They do welcome visitors, and they're very happy to. They have guest houses for men and women, and for retreats and so on. It's a wonderful community, and their singing, as you can hear, is superb. At the beginning of this lecture, I spoke about the role that music has in lifting up our hearts and minds to God, and in providing that emotional kindling which, being merely human, we need. But I suggested that this might not be the primary purpose of sacred liturgical music, and indeed it isn't. That primary purpose is to give praise and thanksgiving to God. We might even say that our being moved and given pleasure and joy by that music is really only an incidental benefit, a side effect of that giving glory to him. Haydn understood this very well, which makes his settings of the Mass often more successful in a Catholic sense than Mozart's. In some of whose Masses we feel more the atmosphere of the opera house than of the church. In thinking about the relationship between these two dimensions, which we might call praise and comfort, his praise, our comfort, we need to be especially alert. Much religious music of the Romantic period fails as religious music because the spiritual element in it is attenuated. For example, in Liszt and Dvorak, or completely absent, as in Berlioz. Indeed, when we listen to his religious music, these words of Goethe come to mind. Classicism is health, Romanticism is disease. The golden exception in this period is Bruckner, and indeed Pope Benedict XVI singles him out in that regard. Again, to quote R.H. Richards, founder of the ALL, he remarked that Bruckner's harmonic treatment in his motets, such as Tota Buccaes Maria, shows how a musical development in the largely anti-Catholic musical milieu of the Romantic era has been baptized into the universality of the Church's patrimony. But all of this music is what is loosely known as art music, or serious music, or even classical music, which, if it's 19th century, it certainly isn't. Today there are few composers, but among those few, James Macmillan is outstanding, whose understanding of the relationship between faith and liturgical music is in accord with that of figures such as Dufay, Origen, Josquin, Victoria. But what of the torrent of music, if one can call it that, which has flowed through various pens and computers since the Second Vatican Council? I don't wish to cause offence by naming the people responsible for the worst of it, but I do want to point to a danger to the long-term spiritual health of Catholics who, in their churches, only hear the ersatz and ephemeral products which have found such wide currency in the Catholic Church in Britain from the late 1960s onwards. Leaving aside the question of cultural and artistic values for a moment, the point of it at issue is to do with what are frequently termed the vertical and horizontal aspects of the Mass. One often hears it said that the old rite is vertical, God-focused, God-directed, and the new one is horizontal, community-focused. It's not as simple as that, of course, but the music of composers since the Council has been overwhelmingly community-orientated, and very often, so are the words it sets. The phenomenon of the worship song was something I first encountered at the Catholic chaplaincy at my university at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. This was the era of the coffee table Eucharist, in which the student congregation sat in armchairs around a low table, circular table. 2 or 3 with their guitars. The priest wore no vestments other than a stole, and the sacred vessels were earthenware. And yes, in case you're wondering, we really did sing Kumbaya. It was terribly exciting. And since then, in many places, worship songs have swamped liturgies, both Protestant and Catholic. Colours of Day, I'm very grateful to a friend for drawing my attention to this ditty. Colours of day dawn into the mind. The sun has come up, the night is behind. Go down in the city, into the street, and let's give the message to the people we meet. I don't know if that's actually by a Catholic, but it's certainly been frequently reported to me as being sung in Catholic churches. The date of it is 1974. I suppose you've heard that the 70s were ghastly, and so indeed they were, liturgically. Although personally I enjoyed them very much, except of course in church. So I don't think we should be drawn into a cultural controversy about the intrinsic musical merits, if any, of this stuff, because these arguments turn out to be circular. and they inevitably produce accusations of the music as being mediocre and meretricious, and counter-accusations of cultural snobbery and elitism, and no one gets anywhere. What we should really be asking is this music worthy to give praise to God? Is it the best we can do? Does it raise the hearts and minds of those who hear it and sing it to the divine? Does it bring us closer to God, or does it provide an illusory effect of warmth and coziness? I'm sure you have your views on this and on everything else, and I look forward to hearing them. You've heard in previous lectures how the ordinary chants, such as the Kyrie and the Sanctus, and features such as the preface dialogue and the various responses, gradually took their place in the sung Mass. And sung Mass was regarded as the norm up to the time of the Council of Trent. Then very detailed rubrics, principally regarding what we call low Mass, Missa Lecta, literally Mass read from the book, were added to the 1604 edition of the Missal of Pius V. And from then on, low Mass was seen as the norm, rather than solid Mass. This slightly changed, in fact it changed quite a lot really at the Council, where they took as the model the sung Mass, not the low Mass, which actually accounts for certain peculiar things, like the sign of peace being in there. But as the sung Mass is today, and what I say about the ordinary form can also be taken mutatis mutandis for the extraordinary as well, we need to consider the balance of the theological with the artistic and poetic in a sung Mass, since, whilst what is sung must be in conformity with the mind of the Church and with orthodox teaching, because we are flesh and blood, and, like Eliot's hippopotamus, susceptible to nervous shock, it also needs to have an effect on us that will, in the familiar phrase, raise our hearts and minds to God. Any music that fails to do that should have no place at Mass. At least that is the theory. But it's notorious that tastes in sacred music differ as much as tastes in everything else. Remember Belloc's couplet about food. Alas, what various tastes in food divide the human brotherhood. You could adapt that to Catholics at a Mass at which there is music. It's also important to be clear that a Mass at which there is music is not the same thing as a sung Mass. It's quite possible that some of you attending a Mass with guitars and drums would find it brought you closer to God. For me, on the contrary, it would be what is called an occasion of sin, since I would end up, if I were able to stay, so angry that I would certainly be in a state of sin by then. There are also people who go to sung Masses in places like the Oratory for what they call cultural reasons. Alexander Pope says of them, as some to church repair, not for the doctrine, but the music there. However, we should try not to be censorious. It may perhaps eventually prove to be a way into the faithful. But for Catholics, that's not enough. We need to recognise that, technically speaking, performance by gifted agnostics is likely to be superior to that of church amateurs, and musically an example to them. But although some degree of technique is indispensable, no amount of it can compensate for the absence of faith and commitment to the liturgy. Father Timothy Radcliffe, writing in the Tablet last November, said, during Mass, we usually sing and make music. This is not the icing on the cake, on the liturgical cake. It is an act of faith, that whatever the violent discords of our time, harmony and peace will have the last word. For, as Clement of Alexandria asserted, Jesus is the symphony, the harmony of the Father. That is at the core of things. But in addition, and this is where I shall conclude, there is something that is personal for each of us. Sometimes it's the most unlikely thing. One example for me is in the Epistle for Epiphany. A flood of camels will cover you, dromedaries of Median and Ephah. Quando confessa fuerit ad te multitudam maris, fortitudo gentium venedit tibi, inundatio camelodum aperiet te,
Dromedari Madiane Tefa, omnes de Saba venient aurum et tus deferentes, et laudem Domino annunciantes.
Now, why that line about camels should move me so much, I've no idea, but it does. Then think of the Hebrew letters sung before each verse of the Lamentations of Jeremiah, set by Talis or Kupra, and just think how they affect us, you know, Aleph, Bet, and all those. They're only letters of the alphabet. I'll just suggest here one other piece of music, which is of a character to move us because it penetrates into the heart of the Christian mystery. So here is our final example. It's the tiny setting, 1.5 minutes long, by William Byrd, of the Alleluia for the Sunday within the octave of Pentecost. Non vos relinquam orphanos, I shall not leave you comfortless. Responding to the sadness and anxiety that the apostles are feeling is leaving them, Jesus offers his reassurance and expressing his own joy at his returning to the Father. Alleluias break in. And it's a sign of Byrd's extraordinary sensitivity. Byrd, I'm sure, the greatest English composer who ever lived, to the text, that all this happens and is felt simultaneously. You hear the Alleluias as the words begin. Personal and unique to you. We should not undervalue such ways into the mystery of the Mass. God gives them to us according to our own particular psychological makeup. Through the Church, he gives us the Mass. And through the Mass and its music, when worthily performed to the very best of our ability, we praise him and receive from him his friendship, grace, strength, and consolation.